First story, the midnight ritual. It started out as a joke. Halloween was the next day, and we were looking for something to do. Nothing big ever happens in Dover, Pennsylvania. It's one of those small towns where everyone knows everyone, and the only spooky thing about the place is how quiet it gets after sundown. So when Jake suggested we try the midnight ritual, we all laughed it off at first. But as the night went on and the beers wore off, we started talking ourselves into it. There was this legend, something about forming a circle of candles in the old cemetery and reciting an old poem. They say if you do it right at midnight, you can see spirits from the past. The kind of stuff you'd hear in high school, passed around by bored kids looking for something to be scared of. None of us believed it, of course, but curiosity is a funny thing. By 11:30, we found ourselves standing at the gates of the Oakwood Cemetery. It was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. We had 5 candles, a pack of matches, and a half-assed plan to summon some ghosts. I'm telling you, it's bullshit, Jake grinned, holding up one of the candles. But hey, if we see anything, at least we'll have a good story for tomorrow's party. Erin rolled her eyes, tugging her jacket tighter around her. Just light the damn candles. We walked deeper into the cemetery, the crunch of leaves under our boots the only sound breaking the stillness. Oakwood wasn't huge, but it was old, gravestones dating back to the 1800s, cracked and weathered by time. There was something about the place that felt wrong. Maybe it was the way the fog clung low to the ground, or the faint rustling of branches that seemed too distant to be the wind. We found a small clearing near the center, the gravestones around us looming like silent witnesses. Jake knelt down, arranging the candles in a wide circle. I checked my phone, 11:58. All right, let's get this over with, I muttered. The 5 of us, Jake, Erin, Sam, Megan, and me, stood in a circle as Jake lit each candle. Their flames flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows over the gravestones. All right, who's got the poem? Sam asked, his voice just a little too casual. I pulled out the scrap of paper I'd scribbled the words on earlier. The poem wasn't much, just a few lines that didn't really make sense. Some old rhyme about the dead returning when called. We all gathered closer, the air getting colder with every passing second. I began to read aloud. In shadows deep, we call to thee. From stone and soil we set you free. By flame and night, come walk once more. From graves long cold, unlock the door. The second the last word left my lips, the first candle went out. I froze, the breath catching in my throat. Jake laughed nervously. Wind. It's just the wind. Except there wasn't any. The air was deathly still. Light it again, Erin whispered. Jake fumbled with the matches, his hands shaking a little more than he'd probably admit. But before he could strike one, the second candle went out. This time, no one spoke. We just stood there, listening. The wind, if you could call it that, wasn't strong enough to explain how the flames kept dying. But it was there, a low, distant whisper, threading its way between the gravestones. I swallowed hard, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the circle. The fog seemed thicker now, pressing in on us, muting the outside world. It felt like we were alone in our own little bubble, cut off from everything. Megan stepped forward, her voice a shaky whisper. Guys, she was staring at someone, standing between the gravestones, a figure barely visible through the fog. Too tall to be a statue, too still to be alive. And then the third candle went out. Erin gasped, her eyes wide as the figure moved. It didn't walk exactly. It just seemed to shift, 1 second farther away, the next closer, like it was slipping through the air itself. The others saw it too. We were all locked in place, watching as more figures appeared, shadowy, half-formed things lurking just beyond the reach of our dying candles. One by one, the flames extinguished until the only light came from the moon, casting an eerie glow over the cemetery. We need to go, Sam said, his voice tight with fear. But when we turned to leave, we realized the way back was gone. The path was swallowed by darkness, so thick and impenetrable it looked like a wall of blackness. No moonlight, no stars, just void. Panic set in fast. We stumbled around, trying to find a way out, but the figures, they were everywhere now, circling us, watching with hollow, empty eyes. I don't know how long we ran in that darkness, but it felt like hours. And then I noticed something. Megan was gone. We hadn't heard her scream, hadn't heard her footsteps. She was just gone. We huddled together, calling her name, but there was no answer. No sound at all except for the wind, or whatever was pretending to be wind, whispering through the graves. Finally, Jake managed to find the gate. Or maybe the gate found us. I don't even remember how we got out, but we did. We sprinted all the way back to the main road, our hearts pounding in our ears. When we finally stopped, Megan still wasn't with us. The police searched the cemetery the next day. They didn't find a trace of her, no signs she had ever been there. But we know what we saw. The part that still haunts me, though, isn't the shadows or the figures. It's what we found when we went back the next day. We stood by an old gravestone, its surface cracked and worn, nearly swallowed by moss. But the name was clear as day. Megan Albright, born 1999, died 2023. I don't know what happened that night, but I do know one thing. Megan never made it out. Second story, voices in the fog. I never should have left that party so late. But you know how it is, one drink turns into three, and before you know it, everyone's passed out or talking in circles. I figured driving back to my apartment would be no big deal. After all, I'd driven those back roads 100 times. Small town, middle of nowhere. What's the worst that could happen, right? I was wrong. It was the night before Halloween, and the fog had rolled in heavy, thicker than I'd ever seen it. The road ahead was nothing but a blur, swallowed by a wall of gray mist that seemed to press in on every side. My headlights barely cut through it, leaving me with just enough visibility to avoid veering off into the ditch. But it wasn't just the fog that unsettled me. There was something else, something off. I'd been driving for about 20 minutes when the static started. At first, it was just a soft crackle coming from the radio, the kind you hear when you're between stations. I didn't think much of it. The old FM radio had been acting up for months. I reached over to fiddle with the dial, trying to find some music to drown out the silence, but all I got was more static. And then voices, faint, distorted, like a half-tuned station trying to break through. At first, I couldn't make out what they were saying, just whispers buried in the noise. But then, through the crackling, I heard it clear as day. Megan. I froze. My name. A voice I didn't recognize, sharp and raspy, almost mechanical. It was calling me. Megan, turn back. I slammed the radio off, my pulse racing. Just some kind of weird interference, I told myself. Maybe someone on a CB radio was messing around, picking up my signal by accident. Yeah, that had to be it. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter and kept driving. But the fog only got worse. Every turn looked the same. Every tree lining the road was a shadowy silhouette blurred by the mist. The road should have opened up into a small highway by now, but it just kept winding through the woods, stretching out farther and farther into the nothingness. Then I saw them. At first, they were just dark shapes in the fog, small, barely visible. As I got closer, I realized what I was looking at. Children. At least 5 or 6 of them standing on the side of the road. They were wearing old-fashioned Halloween costumes, paper masks, long cloaks that trailed down to the ground. And they weren't moving, just standing there watching. My stomach turned. Something wasn't right. Why would kids be out here in the middle of nowhere this late in weather like this? I slowed the car down, my heart thudding in my chest. I thought maybe I could roll down the window and ask if they were lost. But as soon as I reached for the button, one of the kids stepped out into the road, standing right in my path. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. The car stopped just a few feet from the kid. He or she, I couldn't tell, was wearing a worn-out mask that looked like a rabbit's face. But the mask was cracked, the eyes hollow and black. I stared, my breath caught in my throat. The kid didn't move. And then, behind the mask, I heard a whisper. Faint, like the radio static had followed me out into the fog. Megan, that was enough for me. I threw the car into reverse, heart pounding as I tried to maneuver around the figures. I wasn't gonna stick around and find out what was happening here. But the moment I hit the gas, the headlights blinked. Just a flicker, barely noticeable, and then they came back on. And when they did, the road ahead was empty. The kids were gone. I didn't question it. I floored it, speeding ahead through the fog, desperate to find my way back to a main road. The only problem? The road never changed. Every turn, every bend looked the same. It was like I was trapped in a loop, the same stretch of pavement playing on repeat. The trees lining the side of the road, the fog, the shadows, they were all identical, no matter how far I drove. Panic clawed at my chest. I reached for my phone, but of course, there was no signal. Nothing. Just the mocking, empty screen. I slammed it down in the passenger seat, trying to keep my hands steady on the wheel. My mind raced, trying to come up with some logical explanation. Maybe I missed a turn. Maybe I'd been driving in circles. But then the radio flicked on again, all on its own. Static. And then that same voice. Low, dragging, distorted. Megan, come back. I didn't touch the dial. I didn't want to, but the voice kept calling my name, over and over, like it was getting closer, seeping through the fog. I turned the volume down to nothing, but the voice was still there, whispering through the speakers, through the car, through my own thoughts. My breath came faster, panic crawling up my spine, and then, in the distance, I saw it again. The same group of kids, the same cracked, hollow-eyed masks. They stood motionless, watching me approach. It was like they were waiting. I didn't slow down this time. I swerved around them, tires screeching, my heart racing out of control. As I passed them, I felt something cold. A gust of icy air that blew through the car, even with the windows closed. And then, I was back where I'd started. The fog had lifted. The road was clear. But the landscape had changed. The town ahead wasn't Dover. At least not the Dover I knew. The streets were empty, the buildings old and crumbling, like they'd been abandoned for decades. I pulled the car over, stepping out, my knees weak beneath me. I recognized the layout of the town, the old church, the diner on the corner, but everything was wrong. The air felt off, heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I tried to find someone, anyone, but the streets were silent. There were no cars, no lights in the windows. The only sound was the wind, carrying that same distorted whisper. I walked up to the diner, its windows grimy with age. A faded, help wanted sign hung in the door, barely legible through the dust. I pressed my hand to the glass, looking inside, and my heart dropped. There, in the corner booth, was a newspaper, yellowed with age. The headline caught my eye. Local woman, Megan Albright, missing since 1998. I stumbled back, the world spinning around me. That was me. The radio in my car crackled to life again, louder now, the static hissing through the fog. Megan, come back. I turned toward the sound, the wind biting at my skin. The fog was creeping in again, rolling down the street like it was alive, swallowing the town behind me. The voice echoed, insistent, growing louder, more desperate. Megan, come back. And that's when I realized I'd never left the road. Not really, and maybe I never would. Third story, the house at the end of the street. There's a house in our neighborhood, the kind kids whisper about. Old, crumbling, and left to rot at the end of Pine Street. It stands like a ghost in the middle of our small town in New Mexico. We call it the Spirit House. Every Halloween, it becomes part of our tradition. a dare, a rite of passage. No one ever makes it past the front door. They say the house chooses who comes inside and who stays out. This year, it was my turn. I'm Benny, and I'm 12. It wasn't that I wanted to prove something. Okay, maybe I did. I wasn't scared of the house, at least not like the others. It was just an old, boarded-up place, right? Nothing special. The stories were just stories. But when my friends dared me to go inside on Halloween, I couldn't back down. We gathered at dusk. The sun was just dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the street. The wind kicked up the first dry leaves of fall, swirling them at our feet. There were 5 of us, me, Tommy, Jake, Mia, and Laura. They all stood on the cracked sidewalk, their faces pale but excited. "You sure about this, Benny?" Jake asked, his voice shaking more than he probably wanted. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It's just a house." I took a deep breath and walked up the overgrown path, pushing aside the thorny bushes that had taken over the yard. The house towered above me, its windows dark and hollow, like eyes watching me approach. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking with every gust of wind. As I reached for the rusted doorknob, my friends called out from the street, "We'll be right here. Don't take too long, Benny." I waved them off and pushed the door open. It groaned loudly, almost like it didn't want me to enter. The inside smelled like dust and time, old wood, stale air, and something else, something sour beneath it all. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, sweeping over the floorboards and peeling wallpaper. The house had been abandoned for years, left untouched by the living. Or so we thought. The door creaked shut behind me, the noise echoing through the empty halls. I turned around, ready to head back out and call it a night. But the door wasn't there anymore. Where the entrance had been was now just a blank wall, covered in faded wallpaper that matched the rest of the house. I froze, heart pounding. This was a trick. It had to be. I spun around, trying to figure out what was happening. My flashlight flickered again, but this time it didn't go out. The beam landed on a series of photographs hanging on the walls, old, yellowed pictures of children. Their faces were blurred, but their eyes, wide and black, seemed to follow me as I moved. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound confident, though my voice shook. No answer, just the sound of the wind outside and my own shallow breathing. And then I heard it. Laughter. Children's laughter. Faint at first, but growing louder. It echoed through the hallways, bouncing off the cracked walls. My skin prickled with a cold sweat. I turned toward the sound, and that's when I noticed the hallway stretching in front of me. It hadn't been there before. It seemed to go on forever, disappearing into darkness. I backed away, my footsteps uneven, the laughter growing louder, surrounding me. My breath hitched as I turned a corner, hoping to find another way out, but the house had changed. The rooms shifted, bending, stretching like the walls were breathing. I tried another door, locked, another nothing. Panic started to set in. I ran, heart racing, crashing through door after door, but every room was the same. More old photos, more laughter, more shifting walls. And then I saw them. 3 children, standing at the end of a long hallway, their faces hidden in shadow. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching me. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Who are you? What's going on?" They didn't answer. They just stood there, silent, before vanishing into thin air. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My friends. Where were my friends? They should have heard me by now. Shouldn't they have come looking for me? But the house was so quiet, so completely still, as if it had swallowed the outside world whole. That's when I noticed the stairs, narrow and steep, leading up into the darkness. The laughter echoed from above, and I knew, against every instinct, I had to go up. I climbed, each step creaking under my weight, my flashlight flickering with every movement. The walls closed in tighter as I ascended, the air growing colder. I reached the top and found myself in a small room, a bedroom by the looks of it. In the center stood a single bed, dusty and old, with a cracked mirror hanging on the wall above it. As I approached the mirror, something caught my eye. My reflection. It wasn't mine. Not exactly. The face staring back at me was younger, maybe 7 or 8, with wide black eyes like the children in the photographs. I stepped back in horror, and the reflection smiled. A smile that didn't belong to me. Panicking, I ran back down the stairs, through the shifting halls, the laughter following me like a living thing. I had to find the door. I had to get out. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw it, the front door. It was back, right where it should have been, as if it had never disappeared. I ran toward it, my chest tight with fear, and burst through, gasping for air. But when I stepped outside, something was wrong. The street was empty. My friends were gone. The houses looked different. Older, worn down, like they'd been left abandoned for years. The trees were taller, the air colder. I spun around, looking for some sign of them, but there was nothing, just silence. And then I saw it, a sign, a small, rusted plaque hanging on the gate in front of the house. My heart stopped when I read it. Museum of the Missing, dedicated to Benny Carter, the boy who disappeared on Halloween night, 1987. I stared at the plaque, disbelief flooding my mind. 1987? No, that couldn't be right. That was 30 years ago. I wasn't even born then. I turned back to the house, my pulse racing. And then I saw the window. Inside, in the upstairs bedroom, stood a figure. A boy, staring down at me with wide, black eyes. My eyes. I wasn't Benny anymore. I was just another photo on the wall. Fourth story, the lantern's light. I've lived on this farm my whole life. It's been in the family for generations, passed down from my great-grandfather, tucked away in the quiet hills of Tennessee. The nearest neighbor is miles away, and I've always liked the isolation. It's peaceful, just me and the land. But things changed last Halloween. I remember it like it was yesterday. The air had that bite of late autumn, leaves crunching underfoot as the sun dipped below the horizon. I was finishing up my chores when I noticed it, a light flickering out in the field near the old barn. It wasn't much, just a faint glow, but it caught my eye immediately. I stood on the porch for a moment, squinting at the distant light. Must be some kids messing around, I muttered to myself. Halloween pranks, probably. Teens from town thinking it'd be fun to scare the lonely farmer. So, I grabbed my jacket and a flashlight, setting off across the field. The light stayed steady, glowing in that eerie twilight. As I got closer, it became clear it wasn't some flashlight or phone screen like I'd expected. It was an old lantern, rusty with cracked glass, just sitting there on the ground, swaying slightly in the breeze. But there was no one around. I scanned the area, the beam from my flashlight cutting through the shadows. Nothing. Not a sound except the whisper of wind through the corn stalks. "All right, very funny," I called out, half expecting some kids to jump out and start laughing. But the only reply was silence. I frowned, picking up the lantern. It was heavier than I expected, old but somehow still functional. The light inside flickered like a real flame, though I couldn't figure out how it was lit. No oil, no wick, just burning. I carried it back to the house, figuring I'd toss it into the shed and forget about it. But something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here, like it wasn't mine to touch. That night, I put the lantern in the barn and locked up. But when I woke up the next morning, the damn thing was sitting on my front porch, hanging from the old hook by the door as if someone had placed it there. My first thought was more pranksters, so I took it down again and locked it in the shed this time. Double-checked the lock. It wasn't getting out again. But the next morning, there it was, hanging in the exact same spot. I didn't understand. There was no sign of anyone coming onto the property. No footprints, no disturbances. The shed was still locked tight, but somehow the lantern kept coming back. Every day, No matter where I put it, I'd wake up to find it hanging on the porch, its soft light flickering like it was alive. Then the shadows started. First, it was just a feeling. You know that sensation when you think you see something out of the corner of your eye, but when you turn, there's nothing there? It was like that, only more. Every night, after the lantern returned to the porch, I'd catch glimpses of movement, dark shapes skirting the edges of the woods that lined my fields. I'd hear faint knocks at the windows, like something was tapping, waiting to be let in. The worst part was, the lantern's light didn't feel warm. It didn't give off the comforting glow I'd expect. Instead, it cast long, unnatural shadows across the yard, bending the trees and the old barn into twisted, ghostly shapes. Weeks went by, and the unease in my gut grew heavier. I started dreading sunset. Every evening, that lantern would flicker to life on its own, its glow dancing like it was taunting me. I stopped sleeping. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Some nights, I'd wake up to hear heavy footsteps circling the house, but when I'd check, there was nothing. Nothing but that damned light. Halloween came again before I knew it. I don't know what I was expecting, but I hoped, prayed, that once the night passed, this nightmare would end. Maybe the lantern would stop appearing, maybe the footsteps would go away. But something about that night felt different. The air was too still, the sky too dark. Felt like the world was holding its breath. That night, as the clock struck midnight, the lantern did something it had never done before. It went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, like the night itself had swallowed the light whole. I stood frozen in my living room, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, everything was silent. No knocking, no footsteps, just the dead quiet of the Tennessee countryside. And then I heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the field. Slow, steady, coming from the direction of the barn. I rushed to the window, peering out into the pitch-black night. At first, I saw nothing, just the thick, oppressive darkness pressing in on all sides. Then, the lantern's light flickered back on. But this time, it wasn't hanging from the porch. It was out in the field, swaying gently in the wind. And in its faint glow, I saw him, a tall, shadowy figure, dressed in old, tattered clothes, stepping closer and closer to the house. His face was hidden in the dark, but I could see the outline of his broad shoulders, the heavy, deliberate way he walked. My throat went dry. I knew in my gut who he was. The old man who owned this farm before me had disappeared one night. No one knew where he'd gone or why he'd left. The townsfolk had their theories. Some said he'd run off, others whispered about debts or bad blood. But standing there, watching the figure approach, I knew the truth. He hadn't left. He'd never left. He was coming back to claim what was his. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to run. But before I could move, the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, booming, like fists pounding on every window of the house at once. The walls seemed to shake with each blow. I grabbed my jacket, darting for the door, but as soon as I stepped outside, the lantern flared to life, brighter than it had ever been. The light cast long, sharp shadows across the yard, and in that light, I saw him clearly for the first time. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, cold, dead, locked onto mine. His lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only malice. "I never left," he rasped, his voice low and hollow. "You're on my land now, boy." The lantern flickered one last time, and the light went out completely. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of his heavy footsteps closing in behind me. And then nothing.